What's up, hobby friends? In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I do the bases for my Necrons. So I got a little excited with starting Szarekh. I didn't think to record the process of actually doing his base on this model. So for the purposes of showing you how I do the bases, I'm going to be using a blank 32 mil for this, but the process is essentially the same, and you're going to end up with something that looks pretty much like this. Now, I've chosen to do a very simple Martian theme for my army. My army has a lot of detail work, a lot of conversions, and it's a fairly bright color scheme, very bright white ivory armor, and the metallics are fairly reflective. And so in the right light, it's pretty bright. So I wanted something simple, something more muted and darker for the bases that still fit into the theme of sort of a Martian wasteland without drawing too much attention away from the models. So this was a fairly simple approach for me. It allowed me to do the bases on my army fairly quickly, and to do them is fairly simple. Depending on the size of the base and more than likely what will happen in this particular model's case as well, I will sometimes go back in with Scarabs painted in the same color scheme as my army, just to add a bit of detail to the base, sort of like my Necron quote-unquote tufts. I won't show you how I paint those on this video, but you'll paint them exactly the same way as my Necrons, which you'll be able to see in the videos in this series. So we won't worry about that. All we're really focusing on in this video is how to do the texturing. So to do this, we're going to need a few tools. You don't have to use cork. Some of my bases, especially on the larger surfaces, will have these raised areas. And I use cork to provide a bit more of a rougher rock texture to them. But on a smaller base, or depending on how the model expects to stand on the base, that's not something you have to do. When it's all painted and dry brushed up, really all we're looking to do is, or all the cork really does, is add a bit of increased height without too much effort. Again, you can skip the step, it's not necessary, but for larger models, I like to add these in to help break up the flatness a little bit. So I'm using 1/4-inch corkboard that you can get from any office supply store. You just buy them in sheets, break them off, and we just glue them on with Superglue. I like using them to sometimes cover up the pegs in some of the newer push fit or easy build models that Games Workshop has been producing. So all we're going to do is we're going to break off a couple of chunks. We're going to use Superglue, and then we're just going to apply it to our base. You want to make sure that you get a fairly even, consistent coat all over, because when it comes to tearing off chunks, you don't want parts of it to be unglued. So we're going to just use the cork, and we're just going to spread it around. And then to add a little bit of extra height, you can double stack it if you want. So we'll just glue a second piece on top. And then to help it cure, we're just going to dab some accelerant. The cork is a fairly porous material, and so the super glue will absorb very quickly. Along with the accelerant, the curing process should be fairly quick. But you want to give this maybe like 10-15 minutes to fully cure before we go back in with our clippers to then tear apart the cork. The cork glued on, we're going to end up with something like this. So the next step in our process is going to be using our clippers to tear apart chunks of the cork. It is a little messy, so we're just going to put some paper towel down to catch all of the crumblings and the excess. And really what we're looking to do is get rid of some of these flat areas and create a bit more of a slope to it. We want the rock to feel a little more gradual in the texture and not so much like stepped. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take some clippers and we're going to tear apart chunks of the cork. Being careful not to tear apart too much. Just go bit by bit, piece by piece, and be a little more careful at this step. You also want to think about the model that you're going to be putting on top, how the model's feet are going to be positioned, and how elevated you really want this rock to be if the model's going to be stepping on them. Because this is a demo base, I don't intend for a model to be standing on top of this. I'm not going to worry too much about that, but this is something you have to keep in mind or consider as you are texturing these bases. So you can see that we've clipped down a lot of the flat stepped elements. It's created more of a gradual slope to the rock texture and looks and feels a little more natural. So the next step on our basing process is to now apply our Coarse Pumice Gel. Now to do this, we're going to be using a palette knife. Because this is a acrylic medium, or it's an acrylic based material, you can use a brush to apply this. It'll wash off very easily. Just don't let it cure on the brush. And it can be diluted and thinned with water to help with the application or to apply it a little more thinly. But for this purpose, because we want it to be very caked on, we want an uneven texture, we're just going to be using a palette knife. And all we're going to do is we're just going to take slabs of it and we're just going to apply and scrape it onto our base, building up to and sloping into our cork where it meets the ground. One of the reasons I prefer this pumice gel texture as opposed to just using PVA or superglue and sand, I find it's a much more durable material. It doesn't chip or flake as easily as PVA glue might. It's very long lasting, especially once it cures. And especially for gaming pieces and just for larger areas as I'm applying it, it's much neater, it's much cleaner, and the durability is key for me. These gaming pieces will see a lot of handling, we'll see a lot of wear and tear, and I need bases to last. And that's it. That's our texturing applied, and that's all we really do for assembling the base at this stage of the model. Now, this material does take quite a long time to dry, easily at minimum 24 hours, and depending on how thickly you've applied it, potentially up to 48. Something this thin of an application on this tiny of a surface, it's probably not going to take more than a day for it to cure. So what we're going to do is we're going to set this aside to dry for a day overnight, and then we're going to come back and start painting it. So we've given this basing material about 2 days to dry, mainly because I was painting other things in between. And you can see that it's very durable. I'm pushing and rubbing my fingers across the surface, and all that's really flaking off is a bit of the cork because I'm stupid. But the sand material is very durable. It's one of the main reasons, again, why I've chosen to base my armies using this. It's very durable for tabletop, and I'm not going to be worried about stuff falling off or breaking from my models. So now we're going to start putting some paint on this thing, getting some color on it. Normally, I would prime this black, especially if it was for a thing for play. But for the purpose of this demonstration, I'm just going to go straight into the color. So to paint this base, we're going to be using 4 colors. We're going to be using Vallejo's Burnt Red as our base coat. And then we're going to be dry brushing our highlights progressively through Games Workshop's Squig Orange, Ratskin Flesh, and then P3's Moldy Ochre. So taking Burnt Red and just a big beefy brush, we're going to paint it onto the model. Now, because I haven't primed this model or this base black, I'm really going to make sure that I push the paint into all of the little crevices to make sure that none of the cork or the basing material are showing through. The end result still ends up being pure burnt red. I just have to be careful not to let any of the basing material show through. That's one of the advantages of priming, is that once you start painting on top of it, you're less concerned about the shadows as long as your primer was evenly and thoroughly applied. And that's our base coat done. We're going to set this aside to dry because the cork is a porous material and there's a lot of these holes and pockmarks in the sand texture. It's going to be wet for a little bit, so I would say let's set this aside for about a half hour to dry, and then we'll come back to it for our dry brushing. So with the base color done and dry, it's now time to highlight our base. Now to do this, it's just very simply a matter of dry brushing our colors on. So we're going to use an old brush, and we're going to start with Squig Orange. And this is the primary color that we're going to be dry brushing pretty heavily, and so we just want to make sure that we apply a nice strong dry brush over the entire base. So it's at this point as well that I'm considering what model is sitting on top, and as a result, where my light source is coming from, and that's going to dictate how I focus the rest of my highlights. So using Ratskin Flesh, while Squig Orange is still a little wet on our brush, so it mixes a little bit, we're now going to focus some of our highlights. So if I imagine the highlight is coming in this direction, the model's facing this way, I'm going to start focusing some of my highlights coming from this direction. I don't go too overboard with this color. It's very easy to start pushing the base into this flesh tone, whereas I want it to stay more orange. So just keep mixing little bits of it with our Squig Orange that's still wet on the paper towel, still damp, and then we're just dry brushing it across the model. Where I have raised details like this cork for the rock, I'm going to focus a little brighter with my highlights because I want that to be a tiny point of interest and I want it to stand out a little bit from the sand. So with that done, it's now time to do our final dry brush highlight. And for this, we're going to be using P3's Moldy Ochre, but we're not going to be using pure ochre. It's a very strong color, and I don't want this to be a pure ochre. I'm going to take a bit of it and mixing it in with the Ratskin Flesh and Squig Orange that's on our paper towel. And then again, dry brushing. I'm focusing mainly on the cork where the rocks are. And then depending on the size of the base, I might pick out a couple of extra raised patches or tiny areas to inject a bit of this color, but really I'm focusing heavily on the cork. And that's all I do for my Necron bases. I'll paint the trim black, glue the model on top, and in the case of bigger bases where there's more real estate to play with, I'll go back in with some Scarabs and I'll add a bit more detailing to the bases. So you see something like this Scorpic Lord where there's a lot of openness and a lot of flat areas to the base rather than just stick with the basic sand texture. I've added Scarabs to the base to inject a bit of that color. They're painted the same way as my Necrons, so everything ties in, and it really adds that sort of scuttling swarm feel to my army, like they're sort of trailing along like little barnacles or plankton, whatever, what have you. So if you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and don't forget to check out the other videos in my Necron Szarekh series. Don't forget to subscribe for more awesome weekly content, and to check out my Instagram as John the Ho for daily updates on my hobby projects. Until next time, happy hobbying.